Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Traveling in Time. We're going to be traveling back to 1914, the beginning of World War I. World War I used trench warfare as a defense tactic. Trench warfare utilized the digging of thousands of miles of trenches and resulted in stalemates everywhere. The German trenches were considerably better with electricity and new technology, while really the French and the British had counted on the war lasting only a few months, and so their trenches were pretty bad condition. We are following this soldier toward the Western Front. There were actually many different lines and trench fronts, with the front line being the one who would storm into no man's land. Daily lives went something like this. There was always rum in the morning because water was difficult to get a hold of, and then they would have daily chores after their unofficial truce at breakfast. Their daily chores were to keep the trenches clean, so there was something like replacing sandbags or draining out water from the trenches. They also had patrols in places like no man's land. If they ran into an enemy, they either had to do hand-to-hand combat, or they had to ignore the enemy because they could not engage in open conflict, which would make the other soldiers aware and they would start firing machine guns and everyone would perish. Now, they also had sentry guard roles where they would stay awake for usually 2 hours so they didn't fall asleep. But if they did fall asleep, they would die from the firing squad because they weren't supposed to sleep on guard. Let's talk about the rats so you can get another feel for how terrible these trenches really were. A sleeping soldier, as seen here, would just be sleeping when a rat would crawl over.
Oh my god!
The rats were cases of contamination. They spread diseases. They also multiplied by the hundreds. Lice caused trench fever, which would last up to 12 weeks in recovery. Pain and horrible fevers. 10 weeks in, 2 weeks to go. Hold on now. There was also trench foot, which is a fungal infection which could cause amputation. Now get in line, sit down. We have more men to amputate before you. The smell of dead bodies, human waste, sweat, and poison gas was what made the conditions even more terrible. The trenches of World War I were infamous for their miserable conditions. Many lives were lost and many men knew they were never coming home.
I'm never gonna go home. I'm just gonna die here. What am I doing?
There were so many soldiers who lost their lives for a meager few feet of area in the trenches. The moving was slow and there was never a clear victory. Trench warfare will forever be remembered and experienced in memory.